Hello everyone. I am going to be coding a JavaScript experiment today. I had a live stream today where I tried to do some of this live, and my goal was to make it seem easy and straightforward, but because I was live coding, I think it maybe came off as a little bit intimidating and difficult. So I went ahead and coded a quick experiment, and now I'm just going to go ahead and sort of walk through my thought process while I was coding this up and just show how I did it. It's a very simple sort of Stroop task. This is going to be the basis for what I want to do next week, which is actually coding up a web API that can take this experiment and actually save some data from it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I just have VS Code up here, and I'm just going to code all in this one HTML file. All the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is just going to go right in here. And then at the end of this tutorial, we'll have a very sort of bare bones but functional Stroop task. So there's a few sort of components that go into an HTML file. That's just sort of the structure that you have to have. At the top is this doc type that will allow your web browser to actually understand what this file is and what to do with it. We have these sort of HTML tags. So your browser will know anything that comes in between these tags is all HTML. And then we are going to have a head tag, and we are going to have a body tag. There we go. So if you've never seen HTML before, this is pretty much what it looks like. It's just kind of a markup language. It's not sort of a fully functional programming language like Python or MATLAB or something like that. It's more something closer to Markdown, something where you're just kind of supplying these tags. So the actual sort of dynamic programming that's going to be happening is going to be coming from JavaScript. CSS is going to do some basic styling for us. And HTML is just sort of providing the basic elements that are going to be on our web page. Okay, so we need to go ahead and put a few things in this head. This head part of our file here is the stuff that gets executed first. So there's a lot of sort of meta information here that is somewhat useful. Honestly, most of it's not that necessary. This line that I am typing right now is going to indicate to the browser that we have a certain encoding for this file, and we are using UTF-8. There we go. We are going to add a title to our page. Let's call that Stroop Experiment. And already we have something that'll be visible over here. So we have our sort of demo page up. We're going to be referring to this often, constantly refreshing this as we code. So I don't know if you caught that, but you can see up here our title is now Stroop Experiment. All right. And next, I'm going to go ahead and get access to JQuery, which is a super useful JavaScript library that just implements a lot of basic kind of functionality that you might want access to regularly. To get this, what I'm going to do is just search for jQuery CDN. And I'm going to go to this website. I'm going to get the latest version of jQuery. I am going to get the uncompressed version. Of course, you're welcome to get any of these, whatever works for you, but doesn't matter too much, not too worried about page load times. So just going to get the uncompressed version. and I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything that is in this text box. So copy clipboard, close that page, head on back here to our HTML, and I'll just paste that in. So you see we get this sort of super long sort of tag here. I'm just going to enter this down just so it's a little bit more visible. There we go. Okay, so what does this do? This is a script tag. Script means JavaScript, and it is going to get the JavaScript code from this URL. It's going to check that the file that we ask for actually is the file that we receive, just sort of a security thing. Cross-origin, I don't even know what that does, to be honest. Doesn't matter for our purposes. All we need to know is that if we paste this in, we now have access to jQuery and the rest of our JavaScript code. Cool. Okay, so that's everything that I want to put into the head here. And now we will turn our attention to the body. Okay, so in the body is where sort of the bulk of our code, of our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript is going to go. You can split your JavaScript and CSS off into different files, but like I said, my goal here is to show that this is not as hard as it seems at first. Programming these sorts of experiments can be super overwhelming at first, and I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible. So we're just going to put it all in this one file for now, and honestly, for the sorts of experiments that I've written, that probably would be totally fine. So I'm going to use this center tag to just go ahead and center some stuff in the screen. Super useful. Definitely take advantage of this tag. Don't waste your time trying to mess around with CSS to get things horizontally aligned. It can be a real pain if you don't know how to do it. This div tag is just going to create sort of a container for us. And then in our container, we're going to put a paragraph. P stands for paragraph. We're just going to have that say, welcome to the experiment. All right, so let's go back to our web page here. You'll see this is just a file on my desktop. There's no sort of hosting or anything happening here. Go ahead and reload this. All right, we have our text. Welcome to the experiment. Underneath that, we're going to go ahead and put a canvas. The experiments that I do involve a lot of drawing. I have to draw like colored squares and stuff like that. So I like to use a canvas. Even though this is a Stroop experiment, this isn't sort of strictly necessary. I still just really like working with the canvas functionality. I find it pretty intuitive. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick with what I know for this tutorial. So we will be adding this canvas here. And we are going to have our canvas be 600 pixels by 600 pixels. Oops, don't need that comma there. Okay, so if we go back here and actually refresh to this, you won't see any change. When you're coding your own experiments, it can be sort of like really confusing. You know, I just put this element here, why is nothing showing up? It's here, it's just not visible. Okay, so to understand what's actually happening on your page, definitely get comfortable with the dev tools that are available in Firefox, Chrome, whatever your preference is. And in particular, take advantage of this inspect element option, because that will pull up the HTML and it'll show you, okay, yes, we have a canvas, it's right here, and it's 600 by 600 pixels. So we do have our canvas, just hard to see. We can go ahead and make that a bit easier to see with some CSS. So let's go ahead and add that in real quick. We are going to use a style tag to add that in. There we go. And we are going to reference this canvas by its ID using the #. If you've never worked with CSS before, it takes a little bit to get going to understand the syntax and sort of all the options, but it is incredibly powerful, and I really love working with CSS style formatting and styling sort of wherever it's available. I find it sort of really intuitive now that I've sort of taken the time to understand it. So our experiment ID, which is associated with our canvas here, is now going to have a border that's 2 pixels, and it will be solid black. You can see we get these like super handy little bonuses using VS Code. If you are someone who codes in JavaScript at all, highly recommend VS Code over something like Text Wrangler or Notepad++, or even Sublime Text. VS Code is really, really great for HTML, JavaScript, that sort of stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh our page here and see. All right, so our canvas was there the whole time. Now we can actually see that it's there because it has this nice border for us. Cool, so now what I want to do is go ahead and add in some JavaScript that is actually going to execute our experiment. So all of our JavaScript is going to go in a script tag. So just like before, where we had this script tag associated with JavaScript, here we're going to have another script tag, although this time it's associated with our own JavaScript that we're going to be coding here. And the very first thing I'm going to do is just define a function. So to do that, we're going to type function, the name of our function. We're going to call this main. Oops, not mean, main. There we go. Any parameters that we want go inside the parentheses, and the actual code that gets executed will go inside these curly braces. To start, I am just going to go ahead and log something to the console. This is equivalent to like print in most other languages. And we are just going to say hello world. So there we go. Go ahead and refresh here. Right, okay, so I've defined my function, but let me go ahead and actually call it. So you can see we have nothing in the console yet because I've defined my function, but I haven't actually run it. Go ahead and add a semicolon there. So to do that, I'm going to have it execute not immediately, because I don't want my JavaScript to execute before the page has actually had a chance to load any elements that it needs to load, or do any sort of preparation it needs to do. So I'm going to wait to call my main function until I'm sure the page is ready to handle it. And jQuery makes that really, really easy. All we have to do is say window.on load. We are going to call the main function. So onload, call this main function. If this looks sort of like weird and foreign, it takes a little bit of time to get used to jQuery style programming. This $sign syntax is something you see all the time in jQuery. It allows you to sort of easily select elements. This on function is a handler. So there's lots of different options other than load. Whenever something happens, you can have another function execute. And this is the sort of style of programming that's really common in JavaScript that a lot of people who are used to like MATLAB or Python or R get really confused by. Why is JavaScript like this? Well, it's because JavaScript is meant to be interactive, right? You don't want a page to sort of execute top to bottom. You want the user to be able to click on buttons and have things happen when those buttons are clicked on, right? So because there's sort of that user element that we can't really like account for in like a procedural way, JavaScript basically has this pattern of defining functions and setting handlers onto things. And jQuery makes that really, really easy. Okay, so we have our main function. Our main function is now being called. So we can go over here, refresh this, and now finally we get our output hello world into our console here. So always great to have this console open for doing like print debugging. Just remember that you have to sort of use this console.log function instead of a more typical print or fprint or something like that. Okay, so go ahead and clear the console real quick. We don't actually want our main function to print hello world. We want it to actually run our experiment. So in order to make that happen, I'm going to define two functions. The first one is just going to be called setup, and the setup function is going to do something that in many programming languages is kind of frowned upon. It's going to set up something close to global variables for us to access. With how simple the JavaScript I code at least is, I think it's totally fine to sort of have this like global state, but of course feel free to disagree. I'm also going to have this instructions function here, and this is just going to be called to sort of kick off our experiment and run some basic instructions for our participants so that they know what to do. Okay, so let's start with the setup function first, and I should go ahead and change this main function before I forget. Now we want it to call setup and then instructions. Cool. So now to make these functions actually do something, I'm going to go ahead and have a canvas variable here attached to the window. So this window is sort of like global state, and so we can attach sort of various things to it, and now we'll be able to access this canvas from any other function, which is just going to be super, super handy when we are trying to draw to it from different places. Okay, so what is this canvas variable going to be set to? Well, it's going to be set to our experiment canvas, right? So we are getting an element by ID. We set the ID to experiment. So this is going to find our canvas that's in the HTML, and now we have access to it constantly as part of this window variable, regardless of where we are in our functions. Okay, we also need what's called a context, abbreviated CTX. And to do that, we are just going to use this getContext call, and we are going to have a 2D context. Okay, so this canvas, and we can go ahead and make this window.canvas. This canvas is going to give us this context, which we are also going to attach to this window. So we also have access to this context in the global state. If this makes no sense right now, that's totally fine. It will become obvious what these things do in a moment, so just stick with me. And then we're also just going to go ahead and set some defaults here. Let's go ahead and use 16 pixel tall text with the Arial font. And then let's go ahead and by default draw text to the center of the screen. Cool. And now let's go ahead and actually put some stuff in our instructions. In our instructions, we want to write some text. So let's just put a placeholder function in right now called write text. We'll go ahead and define this in a second. We'll say press G for green and B for blue. Okay. We'll say ignore word color, and we'll say press space to start. Cool. All right, so we still have to define this write text function, but once it's defined, that's going to go ahead and write our instructions for us. And okay, I think we are pretty much ready to go ahead and write this function. So I like to sort of stick things that are these sort of higher level functions down towards the bottom. These kind of helper functions I like to put towards the top. So let's go ahead and stick this up here. Our write text function is going to take in some text, and it is going to write it to the context. So now we're accessing this window.context variable, and on that context, there's this fill text function. And we are going to just pass the text that is sent into write text to this fill text function. And then we have to decide where in the canvas that text should go. And we are going to put it in the middle. So that means we need to know the width of our canvas. We'll divide that by 2 to get the center. And we'll do the same thing with the height. Cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we've done. We should get our instructions popping up on the screen when we go ahead and refresh this. And there we go. All right, looking good so far. We have press G for green and B for blue, ignore word color, press space to start. If we go ahead and press space now, not getting anything at the moment, because we haven't actually handled any key presses or anything like that. But first, I want to go ahead and define one more helper function, which is going to be useful for us. I'm going to go ahead and call this one clear canvas. And what this is going to do is just wipe whatever is currently on our canvas. This is something we're going to want to do a lot, pretty much every time we have something new to draw. So having this in a helper function is going to be super, super handy. Again, we're accessing this context variable. We're going to use this clear rect. And what we are passing in is the sort of top left corner of the rectangle and the bottom right corner of the rectangle. And that's going to be 0, 0, the top left. And in this case, 600, 600, although we won't hard code 600, 600 in case we want to change these variables. Instead, we'll just access the canvas variable and use the width and the height. So it's going to go ahead and just put a rectangle on top of our canvas, cover everything up with basically blank, so that we can draw new stuff and not have everything that was there before in the way. Cool, so now we have our clear canvas function. We probably want this to be called every time we write some text. That'll be pretty handy, so we can go ahead and put that in there. And now I think it is time to actually have some trials in our Stroop task. So up the top here, I'm going to go ahead and define some variables that we'll use. First, I'm going to have a list of words, green and blue. I am going to have some colors, and I'm going to go ahead and use hex codes. So if you've never used hex codes before, basically you use this £, followed by a value for red, a value for blue, and a value for green. Or sorry, a value for green, and then a value for blue, red, green, blue. 0, 0 is none. FF is max. These are hex values, right? Makes sense. If this doesn't make sense, you can actually just go ahead and type this into Google and sort of play around with a color picker, and hopefully it'll start to sort of make sense what this actually means. But for our sake, we're going to have no red, a lot of green, and no blue. So this will be our green color. And then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for our blue color. So we have the words green and blue, we have the colors green and blue. And then we're going to have our number of trials that we want. So let's just go ahead and make that 25. And then I'm just going to go ahead and define a global trial num value for this experiment. Simple enough just to have this global variable accessible. You don't have to do it this way. In fact, I often don't do it this way. But here it's so simple. Why not just keep it simple for now? You'll notice that JavaScript has this sort of variable declaration sort of aspect to defining variables that you might not be used to if you are coming from other languages. You also notice there's these semicolons everywhere. To be perfectly honest, in modern JavaScript, you don't really need this var or the semicolon, although it's correct to have them. I don't even know if VS Code will yell at me if I don't have them. Doesn't seem to care. So honestly, if you forget them, it's totally fine, although probably better to have them than to not have them. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to define one more helper function here. And this is going to be something that I pulled straight from Stack Overflow a long time ago. It is a getRandom function that takes in some items in an array and returns a single one of those items. So you are welcome to go ahead and look up the Stack Overflow post that has probably over 1,000 upvotes because this is one thing that isn't sort of natively in base JavaScript. That's one thing that's not so great about JavaScript is it is missing some of that nice functionality that other languages have, right? Like Python has sort of random choices built in to the standard library. JavaScript, not so much. You have to do this sort of syntax where you're saying, take our items array. Math.random is going to give us a value between 0 and 1, including 0, not including 1. It's going to multiply that by the length of the items. So if we got 0.5 and we had 3 items in our display, we would get a value of 1.5. We would take the floor of that, which would give us a value of 1. Floor just rounds down to the nearest integer. And so we would get the item from items at index 1. JavaScript being a 0 index language means that would give us the second value in items. So anyway, not too important exactly how this works, but if you've ever had to do anything like this, you probably recognize that sort of syntax as being a very useful way to sort of quickly grab a random value from an array. Cool. All right, so we have all our helpers. Now what I want to do is actually create a display trial function. So let's go ahead and put that right here. Okay. Cool. So what is display trial going to do? Well, the first thing it's going to do is take that global variable and increment it by 1 so that we actually stop our experiment after we've done a number of these trials. And then it's going to clear the canvas at the beginning of a trial. It's going to get a random word. So we're going to use our getRandom function on words, which again is just green and blue. We're also going to get a random color. And of course, you know, if you're a psychologist watching this, you're thinking, oh my goodness, you can't just do sort of random combinations of your factors. You need exactly 25 of each of the combinations, right? Of course, you could code the JavaScript however you want in order to get exactly the distribution of trials, right? For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just sort of showing the most basic way of doing things here, but JavaScript is an incredibly powerful, flexible language. Certainly, you'd be able to get it to do exactly what you want. Okay, and then I'm going to use this write text function to actually write our word to our canvas, right? So we already have this handy write text function, although we want to be able to pass in a color, and we can't at the moment. So what I'm going to do is just allow a second parameter here called color, and I'm just going to go ahead and give that a default value of black. So our instructions will still show up black. We don't have to define the color there because it's just going to use the default. But if we do pass in a color, that color will then be used. Okay, so we have our display trial function, and now we just need that display trial function to actually be called. We want it to be called after we have run the instructions, but we don't want it to happen immediately, right? Otherwise, the participant wouldn't have a chance to read the instructions. Okay, so if I just go ahead and call this display trial function, let's go ahead and see what happens here. All right, you can see right away our instructions are already gone, and we are just getting a trial immediately, one of our words. So that's not what we want to have happen. Obviously, we want our instructions to be up on the screen for a minute before we sort of move on to the actual trials. And so to do this, what we need are handlers. We want to wait for the subject to indicate that they're ready to continue, in this case with a spacebar press. And once that happens, then, okay, we'll move on. Okay, so I did notice there that it didn't seem like the color was actually being used. That's because while I added the color parameter to this write text function, I didn't actually take the time to have it do anything. So let's go ahead and add that in real quick. To do that, we're going to again access this context variable that we have. We're just going to set the fill style to color. Okay, so just like that, now it's going to actually use this color. Let's go ahead and double check to make sure that's the case. All right, so you can see now we actually have color text. Great. But we still have that problem of our instructions not showing up. We want a handler here, so let's go ahead and put that in. To handle key presses and things, this is what I have jQuery here for. I really, really like this syntax. I find it incredibly straightforward. We're going to add a key press handler to the document. And what this key press handler is going to do is it is going to define this function that takes in E. So this E is the event that occurred. Okay, so every time there's a key press anywhere on the document, this function is going to be called. This function is going to be passed the event, and that event is going to have the variable name E. Okay, so now what do we actually do in this function? We do whatever we want to have happen when something occurs, right? So when a key press occurs, we don't want to handle every key press, right? If someone's like pressing the number keys, we don't really want to do anything. We want to check that the key press is actually a spacebar key press in this case. So to do that, we're just going to access this key code attribute of this event. The key code attribute that's associated with the spacebar is 32. If you are interested in figuring out these key codes, what I like to do is just type JavaScript event tester, and I would spell JavaScript correctly. Pull up the first one, you can see spacebar, I'm pressing it, and you can see key code 32. So there you go. Okay, so if the spacebar was pressed, what we want to have happen is we want to display our trial. Simple enough. Display trial. Okay, we're going to move this out from here. We want it to happen only if the spacebar was actually pressed after the instructions were shown. And I think that will handle that problem we just identified. We have a couple more things I want to add. Let's go ahead and check our progress. Okay, so we refresh. We have our instructions here, G for green, B for blue. Waiting for a second. Now I'll go ahead and press the space bar. All right, so we have our first word here. And that's looking pretty good. And you can see if I keep hitting the space bar, we are getting additional trials. So I'm not going to take the time to sort of add handlers for every single response. This is something that I actually want to do live, where I'm actually showing how to handle key presses and save data using a web API. For now, this is going to be good enough. We're pressing space and getting new trials. However, we don't actually have our experiment end at any point. So I am going to go ahead and just, in our display trial function here, I am just going to have something that will catch if the experiment should end. So let's go ahead and say if trial num is greater than equal to trials, then let's just go ahead and have a placeholder here called end experiment. And we want all this other stuff to happen only if it is not the end of the experiment. So there we go. So now we just need to go ahead and define this end experiment function. Okay, and here all we really need, normally you'd be doing stuff like actually saving your data, all that stuff, but like I said, saving that for a different tutorial. Here I'm just going to say thanks for participating. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. Go ahead and save that. Go ahead and refresh this. And just while we're testing this, I'm going to go ahead and make the trials 5. Let's go ahead and refresh that. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Thanks for participating. Perfect. So that's going to go ahead and do it for this tutorial, I think. If you found this useful, please share it around. I'm getting a ton of requests right now for people who are just getting started with online experiments and who are interested, so I'm making this tutorial mostly for them. But if you've stumbled across it, I hope it was useful for you. I do live our tutorials on my YouTube channel. So far, those have been Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Chicago time, although they may move at some point in the near future. But if you're interested in that, go ahead and subscribe. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and leave a comment, and I'd be happy to help out best I can. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and I hope I see you next time. Bye-bye.